after day to guide from the bottomless pit, but my end was made strong by the hand of the Almighty. We forward in this generation, triumphantly. Won't you live to sing another song of freedom? 'Cause all I ever have, redemption songs, redemption songs. Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. Have no fear for atomic energy, 'cause none of them can stop the time. How long shall they kill our prophets while we stand aside and look? Some say it's just a part of it. We've got to fulfill the book. Won't you help to sing another song of freedom? 'Cause all I ever have, redemption songs, redemption songs, redemption songs.
Welcome back, everybody, to week 2 of the Liberation Music Therapy series. Tonight's focus is on the Praxis wheel. It's an activist framework and the central framework of this entire workshop. So last week we had talked about engaged and entangled. This week we're starting with the Praxis wheel, what it is, and every week for the rest of it we're going to go through each segment of the Praxis wheel. But today is just what is liberation psychology and what is the Praxis wheel. So that's really what it's about. A little history on the Praxis wheel. It's a little concept that I use for my own practice, and it is meant to help guide us as facilitators as we practice with safety, with dignity, with shared power, and with justice. So we'll just do a little review of what's to come. As you can see, week 1 was being engaged, not entangled, which is the spiritual foundation of your own spiritual and or religious practice. Spirituality in our context is an embodied practice, the embodied practice of meaning making and community making. It can be done through many religions. It can be done through non-religions. But the point is that when we're talking about spirituality in this context, we're talking about the embodied spirit experience of meaning and human connection. So that is the most important piece for our work, which is establishing a safe, grounding place so that we can be our best selves when we are facilitating and when we are working with the communities in which we are serving. And so today's format, part 1, we're going to cover a little bit about liberation psychology, and part 2, we're going to cover the Praxis wheel. Cool. So part 1, liberation psychology. So a reminder from last week, liberation psychology comes from a school of philosophy, which is liberation philosophy. course, there would be no liberation philosophy if there were not anti-colonial and revolutionary movements. So we can consider the first Maroon Wars in Jamaica from 400 years ago, the Haitian Revolution, the Indian Independence Movement, the Irish Land Wars, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Watts Rebellion, Zapatistas in Chiapas, the Algerian and South African struggles against apartheid, the Palestinian resistance, Black Lives Matter, the Civil Rights Movement, Stonewall Uprising. All of these pieces are moments of political liberations, and that is the root of everything that this work comes from. And aside from political liberations, all of these movements include a psychological liberation as well. There's a reclaiming of the right to exist with dignity. The other historical context, there's liberation theology. And liberation theology arose when faith communities began organizing in spaces of extreme poverty. It really regards to the lineage of which this practice is coming from. It comes from Latin America, from a Peruvian priest named Gustavo Gutierrez, and he centered his work on the concept of the preferential option for the poor, meaning that as a person, and he was speaking about priesthood, but for a person who engages with the community, you always side with the oppressed first. You always side with the underclass first and work your way upward. This is a type of theology that we've seen across the Black American communities within what might be called the Black church or in the gospel tradition. Now, there's a lot of Black liberation theology. For instance, James Cone wrote that God is Black. So there are many, many ways of interpreting a liberation, people-centered, Jesus-oriented practicing of Christianity. Just to give a couple other examples of where really strong liberation theology movements has happened, but there's been Dalit theology in India, which is the underclass, lowest class within the caste system. Palestinian liberation theology. There have been feminist and queer theologies. There's even a very active deaf and disabilities theology movement working on just theological reclaiming on what language and what processing of the spirit even is. Decolonial thought, which is really the concept of delinking from colonialism. Thinkers like Frantz Fanon, thinkers like Amy Cesar, this is where we are really reconstructing our minds, the way we categorize things, the way we conceptualize our institutions, and where that colonial logic may fall into place. So it's really about uprooting those deep colonial roots. That's what decolonial thought is all about. Critical pedagogy, that's Paulo Freire's school of thought, and we would call it the pedagogy of the oppressed. And this is where education is not considered a filling of a container. It's not a banking model, but it should be a dialogue. So there should be an opening up to helping people learn and open things and start to expand. We'll get into the real words and terminology momentarily, but really the concept is about conscientization or the waking up. And I'll tell you all that when I'm working with, for instance, Black and brown youth, specifically, I am a 40-year-old white male who is sometimes the first white male that is speaking to this person that is not a cop, not a judge, not any of those elements. And that's also, just to be very frank, that's a bit of racism in and of itself too, because a lot of times the judges and the cops that they're working with are also from the same communities. And we like to just continuously whitewash cultural hegemony to not actually address the real people in the real circumstances. But I make sure that I have an open door policy on any topic, especially with the youth. I've had the most uncomfortable conversations in my life with 15-year-olds asking me about the specifics about the Klan and neo-Nazis because they want to know what it's about. Partially, they want to make me uncomfortable. Partially, they want to make the other adults in the room uncomfortable. And so part of it is they're being 15-year-old kids. But part of it is 15-year-old kids ask those questions that everybody wants to ask. white dude shows up in a room and they all seemingly want to ask about white hate groups. But the point is that by actually allowing that space, by being cool, by being chill, by just being like, oh, yeah, let's talk about it. Okay. Like, I answer every question, honestly. I don't hide the fact that I have members of my family who may be associated not with that specific hate group, but definitely groups that are on closer to that than I would maybe like to acknowledge myself. Not necessarily the closest family members, but the point is that they are in my family. They are part of my lineage. So I talk about that with my kids, and that actually expands the consciousness, because when you break through the obvious things, there can be some human understanding. I also never deny any time my privilege gets in the way. In fact, sometimes I try to make a joke first, and that actually ends up being much better at the, just on communicating. Like if somebody says they were going to say something, or so I interrupted you, I go, don't worry about it. I'm a white dude. I probably needed to shut up anyways. Yeah, see? People are laughing in the space. So, it works. Like, it works. It really does work. So, all of this to get to liberation psychology, which is the centerpiece of liberation psychology, is about de-ideologization, or stripping away the ideologies that we've been psychologized to believe. Now, because this course is open to not just mental health professionals, and I am in the developmental stage of this to actually make this a real certified course. This is my getting all the stuff out, seeing how it works. But because this is open to activists and anybody who is in the helping professions, who is working in spaces in which you are working with people who are struggling, there's just a political dynamic that you need to be aware of. By the way, that is literally everybody. But if you're not trained in psychology, I'm just going to give a little brief history on psychology just so we can get into what liberation psychology is. So first, we've got the ancient roots. And so way before Freud, way before Wundt, there were communities, there were human beings in Africa, in Asia, the indigenous Americans, the Mediterranean, coming up with complex systems of mind, complex systems of healing. For instance, the Yorubans' understanding of communal and ancestral balance, or Buddhist mindfulness as an awareness of suffering and compassion. In Islam, there was a serious medicinal philosophy connected to body, mind, spirit, and morality. The Lenape, here on the land that I currently occupy, other indigenous cosmologies centered the relationship with earth and reciprocity. Greek philosophers were studying the concepts of perception, virtue, and debate. So these were all pre-scientific, part of the human experience of holistically understanding the mind, the body, the spirit, and the politic. So for our purposes, psychology officially became a science in the 1800s. The first psychology labs and theories were Wilhelm Wundt, William James, Sigmund Freud. A lot of these are very important people to read. I am a strong believer that study everything. There's going to be problems with everybody. Like a joke that happens in activist circles is, if there's a time machine, never go back in time and meet your progressive heroes, because you will be disappointed. So there are issues with these folks, but the point is that things are starting to become solidified in a studyable, analyzable way of observing the brain and observing the way that we function. So some major schools of thought: psychoanalysis, and that was really looking inward, studying dreams, studying desires, studying our emotions. The unconscious mind is a very famous concept that comes out of psychoanalysis. There's behaviorism, that's really on looking outward, seeing how habits are formed, learning, observable actions, habits. This is, if you've ever heard the concept of Pavlov's dog, where they would ring the bell and the dog would drool, that is behaviorism. Basic training for the army, that is behaviorism in action. It is about doing outside things to adapt a behavior. Humanistic psychology, this is very much where I center a lot of my work, but this is about the concept of human dignity, human meaning, and human agency. So even if a person is making a horrible choice, I let them make the horrible choice, because the point is that I'm not letting them fail, but I'm also not forcing them into anything. When you are in a more humanistic role, you're working with a human being. You are not working with a patient. You are working with a human. So I really do center a lot of my practice in the humanistic school of thought. And then cognitive and neuroscience, and this is more about the actual functions of the brain, thinking, memory, the actual systems themselves. These are all very, very important things. If you're not a psychologist, don't worry about necessarily knowing all this stuff. It's good to check out, like there's a good crash course YouTube series on the history of psychology. You can watch YouTube videos just to get familiar with some of these terms, but this is just to lay a foundation. Psychology then expanded into practice. So we have psychology going into education systems, healthcare, workplaces, into the courts, community life. People have therapists. Psychologists may come in and be an expert witness. Psychology has really influenced tools like assessment, therapy, and research, how we study the way humans function. So cool. Now you all know everything you need to know about psychology. There you go. So we get to liberation psychology. There was a huge era where Black houseless men were disproportionately getting diagnosed with schizophrenia when the more proper diagnosis was probably bipolar disorder. Now, the reason being, behaviorally, on the outside looking in, bipolar disorder and schizophrenia can be very similar in the ups and the downs, the sporadic behavior. If you include just the stress of living on the streets, the stress of houselessness, the stress of lack of hygiene, that is actually a major piece of mental health issues that happens with houselessness. As you lose hygiene, you start to smell. People don't want to be around you. You become isolated even if you're in a room full of people, just because of an aura coming off of you. So that actually impacts the social isolation of people who may be houseless. It also creates reason why people talk to themselves, because there's nobody else to talk to. So there was a disproportionate amount of Black men who the proper diagnosis was probably bipolar disorder, but they were getting diagnosed with schizophrenia because in their psychiatric evaluations, they would talk about the state trying to chase them, the police out to get them, trying to kill them, specific cops having a specific thing out to get this specific guy. The white middle-class psychiatrist would hear everything that this Black person's lived experience was and would just be written off as paranoia. That's how these things systemically impact. And I am, just to be upfront with everybody that is watching this who is of this skin color persuasion, we need to shut up when it comes to saying, I don't think he was racist in his heart. It doesn't matter if he was racist in his heart. The way that the liberation-oriented facilitator thinks, we do not judge people. I don't judge people for being a racist person. I judge racist actions. So if you are doing something racist, you're being racist. You are racist. You're doing racism. It doesn't fucking matter if the person believes it or not. I don't care. The survivorship should be where we focus things when we are orienting around political survivorship. Anyways, liberation psychology, it's rooted in the Latin American liberation movements. As we had mentioned, liberation theology, Pablo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, concept of conscientization, but also political economy and social theory, like feminist and intersectionality, Marxism, anarchism, and various decolonial thought. Frantz Fanon's major decolonial work was probably the biggest influence on the first author of writing about liberation psychology. That was Ignacio Martin Barrow. He was a Jesuit priest and a social psychologist. And the concept that he focused all of his work around was psychology must stand with the oppressed. If we are going to study the minds, we have to start at the oppressed first. I'll get a little bit more specific in a moment, but I want to talk a little bit about just some of the pieces of liberation psychology. The first is the core principle, which is conscientization. Now, that's a Portuguese word. I don't speak Portuguese, so I am probably mispronouncing it in a way that I don't really know how I'm even getting it wrong. But it translates into awareness or critical consciousness. And so all this is linking the personal experience to the social reality. So I will tell you all, I'm going to use myself as personal example to help see how some of these things break down, to see how you might be able to apply it into your own practice or find things that didn't work or just for whatever. Linking the personal to the social reality. One thing that really helped me wake up about my own white privilege was when I was in the United States Army. I was a member, and there were members in my unit who were black men, and they were battle buddies. We were tight. We were with each other for everything. I just want to be very upfront with everybody. I was in the band. I was not in a combat unit. I played piano. We saw a lot of funerals, really heinous stuff that its own type of trauma. But I just want to be clear with people that my life was never in a dangerous situation due to my time in the military. But what I noticed was when I would go hang out with my black comrades, my black battle buddies, if we were in uniform, people would walk up, they would buy us drinks, they would thank us for our service, they would do everything. It was always a fun time out. When we would go out in our street clothes, my black comrades were treated completely differently all the time. Because a lot of them, specifically my first unit I was at, a lot of them were just a lot more from the ghetto, a lot more from the hood. So they dress that way, they talk that way, and all of a sudden we're in a CVS or we're in a Walmart. People are following us around. I would get pissed about it, and my friends would respond with, no, it happens. And what do you mean it happens? And I'm kind of paraphrasing many small circumstances and making it seem like it was one big moment. But really what it was I just started to notice that just by the nature of how we were dressed, we would get treated completely differently. And these were men that were serving in this very country's military, and they were being treated like they were going to steal things just for walking into a store, the same store that I was walking into. So that was conscientization. That was waking up for me. And this happens for lots of people. Every group has moments. I love to give the example that I had a black, houseless, trans woman who, after all the heavy stuff, said one of the most insane things I've ever heard about Hispanic people, like moments later. And so it was just one of those, like, okay, like there are ways, and this thing kind of goes up and down, and it's hard to process. But the point is that conscientization is about linking the personal to the social reality. And that can happen through music, that can happen through storytelling, but the most important thing is it happens through community. It happens through community, learning other people's stories. Just learn other people's stories. So de-ideologizing reality. This is uncovering and understanding systems of power. For instance, had a dialogue with somebody the other day, and we were talking about what goes on in the hood here in New York City, in like Brownsville, and comparing that with what's going on with Gaza, with the genocide happening right now, the genocide the United States is committing, the Israeli government is committing. They would not be able to do the genocide if we did not give them money and weapons. It's our genocide as well. But we were talking about what are the things that link what's going on in Gaza, what's going on in the ghetto, what's going on with the mass shooting crisis here in the United States of America. One commonality is weapons manufacturers make money. That is the commonality. That uncovering the system, it turns out that you can actually funnel it down to like 20 companies. Listen to hip hop lyrics and you will understand the weapons manufacturers in overseas conflicts. How many times have you heard Tupac talk about Smith & Wesson? Same company. Same company, y'all. Social orientation. So instead of thinking on the individual, we need to focus on community, the community's history, and collective power. I might meet a brown-skinned Hispanic male, 17 years old, Dominican. I know it just because of all the flags he's got tattooed on him. Thinking of real people, just so you all know. Like, when I give these examples, I think of real people that I know in... This guy is Dominican. And yet, there are still subtleties. Okay, how long you been here in New York? 15 years. Where you live in New York? The Bronx. Where in New York? Fordham. Okay, now I know a lot more about who you are and where you come from. It doesn't mean that you have to be an expert on people's neighborhoods or people's communities, but as a facilitator, you need to start learning the social realities of the population in which you are working with and for, and focusing on the social as the first thing. So, for instance, when I work in the prisons, I love trauma therapy. I love all the body somatic practices that we use to practice trauma therapy. However, if you are in a situation where there is an opposite gang that literally lives in the same block, the same dorm as you, and they actively want to kill you, there is no amount of somatic exercises that are going to stop that trauma and that fear. So a social orientation will look at a person and see a traumatized person and understand that it is not just the trauma that the person is experiencing with their body, but there's actually a social factor going on. So what can a music therapist do in a situation like this? My role at this point, my role is I go to de-escalate. I de-escalate situations. I play religious music. I play music that talks about heartbreak. I play all of these pieces of music, all of these experiences from talking to the members of the community to learn what music is important for these folks and use that to de-escalate things. Because, yes, the fighting is going to happen. Yes, there is violence that's going to happen. Suffering is real. I would love it to not happen, but it's real. And as much as you want to, maybe wish something to happen, you have to be in the material reality. So you have to judge things by the social, especially when we're doing this kind of liberation work. Preferential option for the oppressed. This is that, the definition I used here is psychology from the people, not for the people, but it's really whatever your practice is. Music from the people, not for the people. I've got classical music training, and I do a thing up at Sing Sing Prison once a month that is technically music education. I don't go in and teach people how to play scales and shit. I mean, I do if they ask, but we go in and do beats, and people go up and spit the sickest shit you'll ever hear. You really do hear the community. And the funny thing is that out of that, you end up getting more classical music involvement, which is just kind of an interesting thing because the dialogue is actually happening. But the point is that you listen to the oppressed people first. You listen to their needs first. You don't assume what you think they need. You ask them what they need. If they're wrong, let them be wrong. It's about humanizing. It's about making sure that people are human. Mistakes are human. Mistakes are a beautiful thing. So that gets us to the final thing, which is methodological eclecticism. It's using every method and tool available. Now, one thing about the psychological sciences or the social sciences, sociology, economics, psychology, the one piece about these kinds of sciences that makes it very challenging, if we're studying lions, we can set up lots of cameras, we can, get an observation tower, we can do all these sorts of things to observe lions in their natural habitat. In various times, different weather changes, lions in captivity. We can do all these things to understand lion behavior, to get just a common understanding on how lions work. The challenge with the social sciences is we are the lions trying to study ourselves. And that is very hard. That is very, very hard. So part of us as understanding these inner workings is we have to understand the storytelling, the ritual, and the dialogue to understand and transform reality. So I will tell you all, I was raised Christian. I do not identify as a Christian, not at this point in my life. One thing I've learned specifically like working in hospice care, I can talk to people of different faiths. And when I first left my faith, the one I was raised in, when I made a conscious choice to separate from it, and this is something that happened to me, this had nothing to do with any of this liberation work. This is something that happened in my own personal life, as I see it, as it was the first break away from the cult I was connected to, the group I was connected to, the white supremacist patriarchal thing I was connected to. That was the first break in it. But anyways, blah, 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 blah. Fast forward, I am now at the point where I studied Taoism and I studied Buddhism, and that really, really helped me understand spiritual reality, helped me understand the embodied practice of feeling things and understanding that spiritual health is different than emotional health and different than mental health. One thing I've learned is that if I talk about Taoism and I say the Almighty, and I'm talking to a Christian, we don't even sound different. Like, just to give an example, I say the Almighty is all around us. I feel the Almighty in myself. I feel the Almighty in you. This is literally what I think when I talk about Taoism. And it is these slight pieces of eclecticism. I don't know what somebody's specific faith, if it's right or wrong. When you're at the deathbed of one Christian, you have an idea of what Christianity is. When you're at the deathbed of 300 different Christians, and there are 300 different versions. You can have the same twins from the same parent, from the same family, same everything, same father on the deathbed, same sisters, and you ask, what's your view on Christianity? What's your view on Christianity? And there will be slight differences. So I've just come to the realization that the reason I don't identify with that word personally is much more of a political statement due to the conditioning in which I came from. But there is a much larger eclectic human story that is actually discussing very much similar things, to the point that I will tell you all that just by hearing other people process and people talk about their own understandings of their own spiritual reality or their own scientific reality, we oftentimes get to very, very similar conclusions, because human beings are very, very smart and we're very in tune, and we have these social systems that were built to keep us away from each other, and it's just something that we need to be mindful of. So liberation psychology is not about the individual, but it is about studying the system itself from a psychological perspective. So the guy who came up with all these terms is named by Ignacio Martin Barrow. He was a Jesuit priest and a social psychologist, born 1942, murdered 1989. He founded liberation psychology. He was really tying together that justice and truth are directly connected to healing. And I'll put this just in perspective of, let's put survivors of genocide. I have, unfortunately, heard a lot of different stories of survivors of genocide. And one thing that is consistent is, yes, the circumstance is one of the worst traumas a person can experience or witness. The violence, the hate, just the everything is just heinous. But one of the most insulting things, one of the most harmful things that survivors often talk about is when the perpetrator just denies they ever did it, just pretends they never did it. That is actually the thing that harms almost the most. Look at Black America and the way that white America continuously denies the centuries of kidnapping and torture and multi-generation incarceration. And we just go, ooh, I didn't do it. Okay, great. This would be the same of talking to a Tutsi in Rwanda and just being like, didn't happen to you. Or talking to Cambodian in the Khmer Rouge genocide, just like, no. They didn't murder your family. Well, no. It was war. It was different. I mean, it wasn't systemic. I mean, everybody died. It's a genocide. It was a genocide. I'm just giving examples of this. But the point is that justice and truth are tied to healing. By apologizing for crimes done centuries ago, it can actually create relief in the current community authentically. And so I cannot speak for all white people. I absolutely cannot. And I cannot speak for all black people. I'm definitely not going to do that. But I will say that I know that when I go into spaces, because it is in an authentic, communicative manner, that a lot of these healing discussions actually start to happen. I have experienced people of different skin tones going through trauma healing just by our conversations because of just not being a fucking dickhead and listening and saying, I am sorry. It is so easy. It is so easy, white people. It is so easy. But anyways, that was way too long of a digression. Ignacio created the UCA's Institute of Public Opinion, which was intended to give voice to the poor. He was murdered by the U.S. trained at La Catla Battalion under the Salvadorian Army High Command. On November 16, 1989, during the Salvadorian Civil War, soldiers from the U.S. trained Alta Cati Battalion murdered 6 Jesuit priests, Ignacio Alacuria, Ignacio Martin Barrow, Segunda Montes, Juan Ram Moreno, Joaquin Lopez y Lopez, and Amando Lopez, along with their housekeeper Elba Ramos and her teenage daughter Selena. This is all at the Central American University in San Salvador. The priests were leading advocates for peace and social justice, pressing for a negotiated end to the conflict between the Salvadorian government and the leftist FMLN rebels, acting under direct orders from senior military officials to eliminate Ignacio Alacuria, who was the first gentleman that I mentioned, and to leave no witnesses. The soldiers staged the massacre to look like an FMLN guerrilla attack, using captured AK-47s that they had gotten from captured rebels, firing machine guns and grenades at the building, scattering papers, stealing money, and planting cardboard signs that read, FLM executed those who informed on us, victory or death. The Salvadorian army had long accused the Jesuits of being subversives, and this false flag operation was meant to confirm that lie. The UN Truth Commission, the Spanish courts, and even the U.S. congressional investigators later proved that the murders were planned and executed by the Salvadoran military, drawing global outrage, accelerating peace negotiations, and marking a turning point in the war. Though most perpetrators were shielded by amnesty for decades, renewed legal action led to the 2020 conviction of former Vice Minister Innocent Orlando Montaño. The victims are now remembered as martyrs of justice and martyrs of social psychology, whose legacy endures in movements for liberation theology, liberation psychology. The reason I wanted to read that is I want to emphasize that when we are talking about conspiracies that are done to communities of harm, we need to be more specific, because it is very, very easy to say the U.S. government sent soldiers to kill a whole bunch of priests. But to give the much more specific examples of that story, for instance, the use of weaponry, how the weapons were obtained, and also the fact that it was proven in the UN Truth Commission, in Spanish courts, and U.S. congressional investigators. So this is not conspiracy theory. This was a real thing that really happened. The same can be said about so many movement builders in many a conflict. Anytime people try to whitewash, for instance, Martin Luther King Jr., just remind them that he was murdered. He was murdered. He was younger than I am right now, and he was murdered. This work can be very dangerous. It can be very, very dangerous, and it's a serious reality to just take into account that the more public your face is, people in power get scared because they're wimps, and they don't like people who talk. So that leads us to part 2, and this is the Praxis Wheel. Now, I'll put it in the show notes as well as in the chat for those that want to check it out later. But the Praxis Wheel is my own concept. It's a trauma-aware, liberation-centered compass or framework that helps to navigate complex situations. It's how we hold safety, dignity, shared power, and justice. So it's a way to guide facilitators, healers, organizers, and just how to move through a space. And the most important thing to realize, this is not a rigid framework. It's like a wooden wheel that I built, and it works well for circumstantial things, meaning that I consider this an activist framework. This is for when you are in the field, when you're working with oppression and suffering, when there is some kind of power dynamic that is taking place in which you are the facilitator or the healer, the organizer. This is just a practical way to guide through, to make sure that you're being productive with the way that you're working with the community. So this starts by putting focus on what is the axis. The axis is the center of the practice. The axis represents the medium in which you are facilitating. So it's the vehicle that you're showing up in. It's how you are actually in the space here and now. So if you're an educator, that is your axis, the topic you are teaching about. For me, I'm a music therapist, so my axis is music. I know that everything I'm doing, for when I go into this space, I put this wheel on, I know that I put the music axis on first. But you can choose your own piece. But the point is that it is very important to understand what vehicle you are actually riding in. Just because that makes sure you know what you're doing. It makes sure you have a direction. Now, I know I said that there is no rigid hierarchy in this format. There is one piece that is important that I do highly recommend, and that is that we always start on the trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive axis. So what this means is that to be trauma-informed is understanding how trauma lives in the body and trauma lives in relationships. And so it's about how we create conditions of safety, of trust, and empowerment. So I run a cult recovery group with the Janja Lalich Center for Cults and Coercion. And it is the most common feedback that we get. The most common positive feedback that we get is, I was hesitant to take the course because the facilitator was a white man, and I was pleasantly surprised with how well he handled the space, or, blah, 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 blah. But the point is that, yes, I am trauma informed, but the actual more important thing is to be trauma sensitive, which means acting with flexibility and compassion. So you're preventing reharm, you're supporting resilience. Now, I do not want people to worry about re-triggering. You're going to re-trigger people if you're doing this work. The triggers are there. It is not about avoiding triggers. It is about being sensitive to them. Just being aware that they're there. If somebody has a response, sometimes they can work through it, and you can be there to help with that. But sometimes they need to step away, and you can be there to help with that. This is your role as the facilitator. You have to be trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive. That is the most important piece. Look ahead. Notice that empathy is further down the line on this wheel. Being trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive is the most important thing. If people don't feel safe, then it's not safe. White folks, every time we have the conversation about we need to have more Black people coming into our spaces, have we made the space safe for Black people? Because usually we haven't. I'm tired of that conversation. I think it's much more important for me to bring resources that I have from the white community and go to places where Black people are organizing and offer resources. Okay? See that? It is different. It is different. Same concept, same humanity, but not so colonizery. It's a new term, colonizery. The second spoke is about being culturally relevant and identity affirming. So being culturally relevant means grounding your work in the lived realities, the lived histories and traditions of the people we serve. I brought up that last week, how it can actually be very racist and very ageist for a person who looks like me to go into a space of all black men, 19 years old, and just automatically come in with 90s hip hop music like Tupac and Biggie. Because those are the most obvious things for somebody of my age group to know about, the probably most obvious music form in prison. And yet, you go into a space and all those folks, it's like, yeah, my grandpa listens to Tupac, or my father listens to Tupac. It's like, yeah, I listen to K Flock, I listen to Lil Durk, I listen to Lil TJ. So the reason I point this out is that if you are looking at a group of people as a monolith and you have not started to actually learn the culture, not just the racial culture or the ethnic culture or the gender culture, but also the age culture, the location culture. There's a difference. I'm in New York. There's a difference with Queens and Brooklyn. There's a difference with Crown Heights and Bed-Stuy. Like, those are two neighborhoods in Brooklyn. There's differences. You got to learn the culture of the people that you are working with. So the other piece is identity affirming. So you're making sure to study the culture of the community, to just be aware. And the biggest piece, the biggest way that I try to be culturally affirming is I ask people, what kind of music y'all listen to? And usually let the folks say the answer they're going to say to me first, which is when they look at me and I'm a white dude, they go, yeah, I listen to everything. Oh, cool. Like what? Country, Kenny G, which, by the way, may be true, but it is oftentimes not the main music source that, so-and-so of the Bloods of the Crips necessarily is like listening to when they're going down the street. But they see me and they're going to say that kind of music. And I go, oh, okay, cool. Yeah, I like that kind of stuff too. I actually like, and I might mention a more serious artist. Like, yeah, I like that stuff too. I really, really like King Von. Like, for real. Like, I actually do listen to King Von. What? You like what? Yeah, Crazy Story Part 1, Crazy Story Part 2, Crazy Story Part 3, Blaine's Story. That's a very easy thing to remember, y'all. Just to give an example, like learning song titles. But the point is that creates an actual cultural relevant thing. And so that's the outside looking in. The identity affirming is looking at the individual humans and who they are and what they add to the space. And this can include race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, ability, their social class, their faith, their culture, their nationality, their community roots, which, again, neighborhood, borough, city, region, land of origin, diaspora, etc. This culture and identity are sources of wisdom. People know themselves. People know their culture. Trust people. A really great learning I had a few years ago was the trainer brought up, it was an LGBTQ training, but the man who taught it was a heteronormative, large black American man. And he did one of the best LGBTQ trainings I've ever had, because what he did was he really got the room kind of riled up on talking about transgender issues. He showed a video of a conservative Christian family, African American, who had a trans daughter, and how they were raising this daughter, and the confusion that the parents are working through, listening to their child and knowing their child is serious and honoring their child. So this guy would play this video, then he lets the training room break into whatever argument was happening at the time. This was like 2022, so like just the culture war thing was insane at that time. A lot of my coworkers, just to be frank, a lot of people from the ghetto, a lot of more like working class black and brown folks. So like just a lot more homophobic views in the room than might come up in like a college space. But the point is that the facilitator actually did something kind of trigger the dialogue. There were people in all perspectives. People being like, you can't change your gender. That's an impossible thing. Like, you're born how you're born, all the way to people know who they are. You got like, it was literally that kind of like back and forth. And finally, the facilitator changes the topic. He's like, all right, it's getting heated. He starts talking about, he's like, you remember your first girlfriend, first boyfriend in high school? Everybody starts, oh yeah, I remember. He's like, yeah, who was your first like crush? And everybody starts talking, and he literally let us go for like 20 minutes. People are talking about when they're like 6 years old, about Susie Jane and how I used to walk by and, you know, all this stuff. And as he lets everyone just get comfortable and start sharing their stories of being 4 or 5 or 6 and their first crush, and the facilitator's like, you're disgusting parents. Allowed children to have romantic and sexual feelings towards other people. That is disgusting. Kids do not know themselves. Kids don't know themselves. You have to remember that kids are just like kids be kids. Wait a second. You mean you all knew yourselves when you were 4 or 5 or 6? Oh my. It was one of the best things, because I've never seen people change their mind. I'm sure a lot of them did not change their mind. But there were a few that actually were like, I had never thought of it that way. I had never thought of that. I've never had to question it because I don't live in a society that my gender doesn't align with the norm. And so the point is that it's very important to be identity affirming. I cannot stand the argument when people say, I don't get the fill in the blank thing. It's like, yeah, of course you don't get it. You're not from that space. Why does that mean that then it's okay to dehumanize another culture or another human being? It's not. Okay, get to the next book. This is about accessibility. And again, this is about activist framework. So meaning that you cannot necessarily plan for everything, but make sure when you are in a space that you have verbally or physically communicated with every single person in the space. The way I do it, when I'm in the prisons, I walk up, I fist bump everybody. Every single person. I make sure just to walk up, do the fist bump. Sounds like nothing, except that little bit of communication brings a little bit more cohesion. When you actually communicate with every person, you can start to learn what people's needs are. That can be neurodivergent needs. Somebody might be a little more fluttery. Somebody might be just a little more disorganized. But you are just paying attention to what people's needs are. And with that, there's nuanced participation. And that means that we're recognizing that not everyone engages in the same way. So you can value quiet participation. You can value somebody who's very deep into listening. You can value somebody who is the class clown, who's extremely expressive. One thing that I have changed is I now never am up on people for being on time. If people show up late, whatever. People can show up 45 minutes late to a group. Hey, what's up? Yeah, don't even worry about it. No, I don't care. The funny thing is, it's a neurodivergent way of thinking. Not everybody is necessarily lined up with the way we've structured time. Time is a new invention in the human experience. I think it really didn't start to become solidified until 1883. And it wasn't signed into law until 1918 in the United States, just the time zones. So there are people that have not adapted or evolved to being on time that rigidly. It's like, I'll be upfront. Like, I think time is a beautiful thing. I think organized time is a good thing in general. But the rigidness that we focus on people having to be somewhere on time is a new invention that not everybody is adapted to. And so I make a point to not give a fuck. I don't care if people show up late. And the thing that is very interesting as a facilitator is that by relieving that bit of pressure, by allowing that bit of nuance, oftentimes people start showing up earlier, like the next week. So it's by being more affirming, you're actually helping heal the space. You're actually helping heal the space. So now we get to empathetic concern and compassionate action. So empathetic concern is that we as facilitators are always being other oriented. So our emotional awareness is other oriented. And that's what arises when we're sensing the suffering or the joy. But it's that authentic feeling of care, that authentic feeling of connection through shared humanness. And what I mean is that we need to look at every human being as a human being. And I know every person listening to this thinks of that intellectually and understands that intellectually. But what empathetic concern is that we need to understand that there are ways that we've been conditioned into viewing other folks. There's a really great book, My Grandmother's Hands, which is about racialized trauma, and it really helps uncover how just due to the nature of chattel slavery and the physical labor that was required upon the enslaved people, there is a myth built into white consciousness that Black people are more tough or more able to withstand physical pain. This is insane. This is an insane worldview that I've never met a person who consciously thinks that. But the moment it got pointed out and I started to pay attention to my own behavior, it is so clear that we look at other races. We all do this. All of us do this in varying ways, varying circumstances. My demographic happens to be the one that controls everything. So we are responsible for the most oppression. So there has to be accountability for people of this demographic. But the point is that we have to literally understand on an embodied level that everything you feel as a human is felt by every human. Even narcissists, even sociopaths. They may be stunted. There may be varying, changes. There may be perception differences, but any feeling you have felt of being insecure, of pain, of being scared, of being sad, of being happy, has been felt by every other person on the planet. And it's important for us to have that empathetic concern as a basis. Now, notice I did put empathy later in the Praxis wheel. It is not first. Having empathy is a beautiful thing, but you have to be aware of that empathy. If you go into a place where you empathize with everybody, but you have no trauma-informed care, you're going to harm the community that you're trying to help. It doesn't mean that it will absolutely happen, but you're more likely to. This is how we become engaged. Yes, if you feel empathy strongly because you're a healer, take it in. But the point is that we have to be mindful of that. So compassionate action, this is the intentional practice of transforming empathy into movement. So taking tangible steps to relieving suffering or confronting injustice, nurturing collective well-being, or nurturing a collective health within ourselves as well. I'll tell you all that just on a personal practice, that by humanizing other communities and by putting other communities first, I've actually healed more myself. In a strange way, the selfishness of trying to self-heal, I actually started to self-heal when I started trying to work with other communities. So guess what? If you're working on self-healing, work with a community. It's important. It's important. So it's just about being oriented in a productive way with your empathy and productive with your compassion. A really good group to study who has a lot of good resources on compassion is Life After Hate. They are a group that works with former hate group members. So oftentimes the people that are our enemies on the streets, they work with people who have escaped those groups. And a lot of them are actually from those groups. A lot of my cult recovery group work actually developed with some of the former hate group members just because they have such a great understanding of how heavy and powerful hate is as an emotion. And they really have some of the best resources on compassion because they work with the perpetrators and the worst of the perpetrators of violence and on how to be a compassionate worker with that community. We get to embodied mindfulness, and it's important that we're mindful. And this is the practice of being aware in the body, being aware of our sensations, our breath, our language, our movement. It's about just being grounded. We have to make sure to always keep ourselves grounded. I think it's important to be mindful. The reason why I put trauma informed and mindful at the exact opposite of the spectrum on this wheel is that by being trauma informed, you're setting the foundation of the space. But by being mindful, you are moving intelligently through the space. I talk about this all the time that, I'm talking to white people a lot just because I'm one of y'all. But the thing that I find white people need to be very mindful of is when we say something that is a microaggression, it is okay to say a microaggression. The issue is not that you said it. The issue is what did you do after you said it? And through a mindful practice, we just have to be aware the thing happened. We have to be aware that we can take ownership of it and it can pass away. It is literally just normal mindfulness practice, but it's with our language as well. So it's just important to be very mindful, not absent-minded. Absent-minded is the opposite. Now, people in the space, I'm sure, are absent-minded in your life. I'm very absent-minded. Talk to anybody who knows me. I go all over the place. But the point is that when we're in the facilitator role, we have to be mindful. We have to be just aware of that. We finally get to education. And this is about educational practices and transformational practices. So education is how we're cultivating reflection, critical thinking, mutual learning. Transformation is actually about the lived experience, about consciousness. So for instance, educational practices, I might teach somebody about trauma and give them all the resources about the 4 types of trauma, maybe put it in like a leaflet that I hand out. So that would be an educational practice. But a transformational practice would be teaching somebody a trauma exercise on how to regulate the body or how to meditate. So education is about the knowledge, transformation is about the wisdom. Now I want to point out that education is this far along on this circle because it's important that you set the stage as being a trauma-informed place. It is important that you acknowledge the human beings in the space through their culture, their identity, and making sure it's accessible and nuanced in just the way that people are going to show up. You don't know what's going on in people's lives. You just don't know. Somebody could be super moody and you find out that their grandmother is on their deathbed and they're locked up and they can't see their grandma. And they're never going to see their grandma. They're being super moody. You just don't know what's going on in people's lives. But you have to be accessible and nuanced. And then you can really start to be your empathic self or your compassionate self. But in that compassion and in that empathy, make sure you are being mindful. And then it is safe to teach. That's how I feel. Then it's safe to actually give resources. All right, now we can talk. Now we can actually communicate. The space is set. You are affirmed as a human. We've developed a relationship. I feel safe in the space as well. I feel I can navigate the space in a healthy way. So now we can talk about teaching. So this gets to accountability and collective agency. So I am not a libertarian. I think the libertarian movement is completely insane. I'm a libertarian socialist for sure, meaning that I am anti-authoritarianism, anti-totalitarianism of the people, but I am not at all aligned with any of these whack job right-wing libertarians who think that it's populist to give billionaires tax cuts. I don't know how that's populist, but whatever. They say racist things, so I guess that means they're of the working people, but whatever. Yeah, right-wing populism, libertarianism is a fraud. It really is. But the reason I say all of that is that community always talks about you need to be accountable, personal accountability. I agree to an extent, Once you have established a trauma-informed place, acknowledge people for them for who they are, made it accessible, show up with real empathy and compassion, are mindful, give a safe place for educational practices so that they can learn and develop, then yeah, sure. Then a person can be accountable for some of their actions. That's how I feel. Once all of those things are there, then yeah, sure. Yeah. If you're a teenager who has never had parents because both of your parents were killed when you were 3 or 9, you lived in the foster care program your entire life, you got into a community that protected you and kept you safe, got you a lot of money, got you a lot of girls, got you like all this stuff, but you also got involved with doing violence or doing these other things that are the trade-off for living in that space. You can't blame somebody for doing something violent when they're stuck in that circumstance. It's like, I have so many 13-year-olds that are in for homicide cases. They're gang involved. They were put up to it. Older people put them up to it. The older people also, that was what happened to them. So it's not like they're just these sinister, evil older people. Some of them are. Some of them have become that. But it is that there is a systemic thing going on. So yeah, once we start to educate about trauma and about the social policies and things, then yeah, there can be accountability. But accountability means taking responsibility for one's actions and the impacts on others, especially across power differences. If you have more power, you need to be more accountable. You have to be self-aware of your own power. I will let very racist things get said if it is by a homeless person or by a person who is in dire poverty. I will let pieces of bigotry go past in a way that if you are an upper middle class white lady, you will never say that shit in front of me or in front of any of my clients. But it's because the power dynamic is different. I will never not address things. Like, I had a young black gentleman once say something extremely anti-Semitic in the middle of a group. And he wasn't even aware that what he said was just heinous. I pulled him aside after, just talked to him about it. He literally didn't know what he was saying. He said, Jews own everything. And I was like, all right, let's talk that through, man. I'm married to a Jewish person. She doesn't own anything. I know a lot of Jewish people. They don't own nothing. Like, we had to break down a lot of things because in his world, outside of his incarcerated experience, most of his landlords were Jewish men. So in his world, yeah, Jews own everything. But what he was saying has gotten millions of people killed. You know, those sorts of conspiracies have gotten people who have no connection to financial capital to just be accused of being creatures from another planet, like just absolutely insane things. But the point is that this person, yes, they may have said something completely heinous and bigoted. If a white person had said the same exact thing, I would have talked to them a lot different, just because the power dynamic is different. The point is that there needs to be accountability with your power dynamic. Collective agency, this is shared power of community to act, decide, and transform conditions and circumstances cooperatively. That sounds very lofty. We will actually talk about it when we get to it, because it is kind of lofty, but it is a little more, we're really thinking more precise and micro. We're not thinking big necessarily in real time. I will never go into a space assuming that like I fixed everything or healed everything or any of that. That cannot be what the understanding is. So collective agency is just, there's nuance to it. And so finally, the last piece of the praxis wheel is liberatory truth. This is the process of identifying reality hidden by oppression. So identifying what is silenced or distorted. So for instance, I was speaking to somebody right before doing this about one of the interesting dynamics of talking to black men about the patriarchy and watching these men start to understand that they have been oppressors while also being oppressed. And it's a very weird thing to realize that. And it is I imagine it is a weird thing to realize it as a black man in the United States of America. But that's what this liberatory truth is to start to have those hidden realities of oppression and just those pieces of understanding that it is a fluid thing we're moving through. And oppression changes constantly. There are moments that you might be oppressed, and then you have power in another moment. I will talk about the Black woman lawyer, somebody who has a decent amount of power in the world, but then has to deal with all this racist, patriarchal nonsense going on in her firm. But then this person will go home and they own the house. This woman runs everything. And it's one of those pieces how the power dynamics are shifting constantly. And we also need to make sure that we're addressing those things. If you have power and you see that nonsense, address it. You have to address it smartly. We'll get into that also. But that's what understanding justice is. And that is seeking fairness and transforming systems of harm so that healing and dignity are actually accessible to all, not conditional. And with that, for next week, we're really going to be doing a deep dive into being trauma informed and trauma sensitive. And we're going to go through each spoke every week now. Just a big deep dive into each spoke. The trauma informed and trauma sensitive. We're going to cover stress responses. We're going to cover generational trauma, and we're going to cover somatic processing or body processing, like the nervous system that lives in our body. And we're going to really look at the different types of trauma and stress. So wow, my slide looks nonsense with that logo. I definitely bumped something before hitting publish. But anyways, yeah, there's post-traumatic stress disorder, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, moral injury, which is something that I do not think gets enough notice in the mental health fields, but moral injury is a major piece of this work. And that is also connected to compassion fatigue and burnout. And then a lot of you, I'm sure, have heard of the terms fight or flight, but it actually expands deeper. There's fight types, flight type, freeze type, and fawn type. And we're going to get into all of that next week. Again, I'm leaving this just up for people if you want to donate. This is completely free and open to everybody. However, I am putting my labor into this, and economics helps. There's a suggested donation of $25 or $200 for the course. But again, this is free for everybody. Come no matter what. This is just to help out if you can. But I left the stuff up on the screen. I'll leave it up for a little bit. You can also check out my website. There's a payment options section at dorianwallace.com. But I'll leave this just up on it. And with that, I'm actually going to stop the recording. Thank you all so much for attending this week. And this is the Liberation Music Therapist. And I'll see you all next week when we get into trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive practice.
Ships. Many thought the day to God from the bottomless pit, but my hand was made strong by the hand of the Almighty. We forward in this generation triumphantly. Won't you give to see? Now the songs of freedom, it's all I ever heard. Redemption song, redemption song.
Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. Have no fear for atomic energy, 'cause none of them can stop the time. And how long shall they kill our prophets while we stand aside and look? And some said it's just a part of it. Well, we've got to fulfill the book. Won't you hear me sing another song of freedom? It's all I ever had. Redemption song, yes Lord. Redemption song.
Redemption song.
Wop, choo, wop, choo, wop.
Come on with the people.
Wop, choo, wop, choo, wop.
Come on with the children.
Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. Have no fear for atomic energy, 'cause none of them can stop the time. How long shall they kill our prophets while we stand aside and look? Some say it's just a part of it. We've got to fulfill the book.
So won't you help me sing another song of freedom? It's all I ever had. Oh,
Redemption song.
yes, Lord.
Redemption song.